several successful Ukrainian counterattacks along the front, reports of a large arms delivery from Turkey to Ukraine, and, according to the Russian side, a Ukrainian attempt to land troops across the Dnipro. We will talk about this, as well as the developments at the front and what lies behind them, including the new findings about the drone attack near Leipzig. All of this in this situation report.
Holy cow, now save the most at Holy with my code.
The Ukrainians continue to attack Russian infrastructure. A gas facility in Tyumen was hit, the refinery in Krasnodar, and also the refinery in Kherson. Currently, there are concerns on the Ukrainian side that Russia could begin its winter campaign, that is, attacks in preparation for winter, by destroying energy and water supplies as early as August. In the past, they started in September. This time, they could begin in August to cause maximum damage even before Ukraine's Independence Day. Russia would take advantage of the Ukrainians' current weakness in air defense to cause maximum damage. Russia would probably also draw on its strategic reserves to take advantage of this opportunity right now. And that's self-explanatory with a 100% hit rate, at least when it comes to kinetic means. So electronic warfare will still be successful in some areas, but currently, the Ukrainians are not able to shoot down ballistic missiles. And of course, it makes sense for the Russian side to take advantage of that, because in the future, Ukraine will again have ways to keep the success rate from staying at 100%. In that context, it's also conceivable that we could see unprecedented Shahed attacks, because Russia has recently used noticeably fewer of them. Recently, it was actually always just a little over 100. The number 200 hasn't been exceeded for quite some time. That was noticeably less than usual. So unless production is being massively changed and therefore reduced, because the Russians demonstrably now have more jet-powered drones, and for that, they might have to modify the production lines. Or if the Russians aren't deploying as many along the front for tactical support, which is also not known, then Russia should be sitting on growing reserves. However, there are repeated reports of Shahed activity along the front, and also repeated destruction on the ground, where drones have been destroyed on the ground, but we don't see either in a quantity that should compensate for what the Russians are currently deploying, especially since the Ukrainians themselves say that the Russians want to produce 11,000 Shahed drones in August, meaning drones of the Shahed class. That is even the Ukrainian view. In addition, the Ukrainians report a helicopter pilot killed in a crash. So not only has a helicopter pilot been lost, but obviously also a helicopter. I didn't catch what type of helicopter it was. On a combat mission, which suggests it was either a Mi-8 or a Mi-24, but nothing else is known. Let's move on to the developments along the front, and we'll start in Vovchansk. Ukrainian forces have now also been sighted in Taika. Here, that's on the map at this location. So, we have nothing from Sumy, and Taiki is here. That means last time, we had the Ukrainians in the Lyman, which is near Vovchansk. Now they are here as well. So we can see Ukrainian movement is taking place in this direction. But it's too early to conclude that the settlements have been liberated. Because of course, there can still be Russian positions there at the same time. But we see how the Ukrainians are advancing there. The Russians, on their part, report that they have captured Ivanivka. That's right here at this point. Ivanivka, we have it here at this location. The Russian Ministry of Defense reports it, and a Russian military blogger says, as soon as I had finished my morning report yesterday. At that point, the northern group of forces had already announced the liberation of the village of Ivanivka by units of the 126th Motorized Rifle Regiment. For context, you can't even get anywhere near Zakharivka. There is no significant presence in the village. Maybe 1 or 2 people managed to make it to Zakharivka. We hope that they somehow managed to get to safety and are still alive. Otherwise, dozens of guys have already been killed on the way to Zakharivka. The ratio between those who made it to the safe zone and those who reached their destination is 1 to 10, or even worse. So, 10 will fall along the way for every single one who reaches the destination. And then Ivanivka, they probably push the guys forward like that, because the commanders have to catch up to their own reports. That would further suggest the Russians are likely causing unnecessarily heavy losses of their own by issuing false reports. So he says here in Zakharivka, at this spot, there might be 1 or 2 Russian soldiers, but in Ivanivka, nothing. Here, we naturally notice that this differs significantly from the deep state map. A Ukrainian report also fits with this, stating that the Russians are already infiltrating Belgorod. There was recently this 6-meter-tall Russian soldier. In other words, an AI forgery was spotted. However, this has already been denied elsewhere, so it's not entirely clear what's happening in Belgorod. And by the way, it's just as far from the front down here as Ivanivka is from what the deep state map shows. So I'm going to compare it here with the other available maps. Petrenko is a Ukrainian military blogger who, in my experience, is reliable. He presents the map roughly the same way as the deep state map does, so he's relatively close to that. The pro-Russian Suryak already shows Ivanivka as Russian-controlled, but in my opinion, he mainly relies on Russian reports and rarely on geolocated evidence. Prymorske, by contrast, works from geolocated evidence, and there we see that we have nothing nearby in Zakharivka and Ivanivka, even though Prymorske is Russian and takes pro-Russian positions. Motto Patriot. That's Antony Anatoly Robin. He says here that the Russians have moved closer to Ivanivka and Zakharivka. Here to the west of it, we can see that. But even there, both villages are classified as being under Ukrainian control. Many of the mapmakers work with visible evidence, like traces. To leave fewer traces on the internet, today's sponsor can help them. Do you know what really annoys me? Unwanted emails or even calls. Today's sponsor, Incogni, has a very simple business model for this. For a small fee, our data is deleted from the internet. We all click on accept terms and conditions on the internet without reading them, often even with free offers. Often we agree to the collection of our personal data, which is then sold to data brokers. That's not just our email addresses and names, but often also our date of birth, home addresses, and purchasing or service behavior. Every search query, every product viewed can ultimately be recorded. This data can then be used for spam, but also for many other things. Insurance can become more expensive if your behavior is considered risky because of your browsing history. Banks can deny loans if the data suggests a lack of willingness to repay. Incogni is here to prevent exactly that. Basically, it ensures that we don't have to pay all the costs for what we use for free on the internet. You sign up, give the company permission to act on your behalf, and then they get to work deleting your data. I can directly track the progress and see that my data is already with 200 data brokers. If the brokers cause problems, Incogni keeps at it until my data is gone. Month after month, they continue to protect my privacy. New entries are immediately deleted again by Incogni. Meanwhile, Incogni even offers on-demand removals, meaning Incogni can enforce deletion from a specific website at your request. If you also want to get your privacy back, you'll find the link in the description. By doing so, you not only support the channel, but you also get a 60% discount when you use my link. I've had an annual contract since September 2024, so they keep deleting my data continuously, and now I get significantly fewer emails. Thanks for supporting the channel. Now let's return to the video. We'll continue with the developments along the front. And first, we'll move here to the southeast. We haven't received any reports from Veliki Burluk, and from Kupiansk, we have a new geolocation of the Russians in Kupiansk Vuzlovi, right here at this spot. So, there are Russian soldiers there, and infiltrations are still ongoing. The village is almost certainly not under Russian control, but the Russians have once again managed to enter the village, and that is, of course, significant. Because if the village falls, the bridgehead over the Oskil too will be split into a northern and a southern part. That would make it much easier for the Russians to advance. Realistically, their presence there is likely already significant and sufficient, because that will, of course, make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain a connection between the north and south, if there are already individual Russian soldiers who can disrupt or attack those efforts to maintain the link there, etc. That's it from Kupiansk. Further south, towards Borowa, the Ukrainians have apparently advanced in several places. So on the one hand, we have Anatoly Radov, who says the Russians, the Ukrainians, have advanced south of Bohuslavka. and he says everything at Novoplatonivka has been taken, and probably also Borivska and Drivka. At least that seems to be the most likely village. With the translation, he naturally uses Russian names. I'm not 100% sure. But here is Bohuslavska, and south of it, the Ukrainians have advanced. This is the village of Novoplatonivka, where the Ukrainians have advanced to the east of it. And this is the other village. That means we probably have Ukrainian successes roughly in this direction. The Ukrainians have probably managed to push the Russians back significantly here at these locations. In addition, attacks near Ritkodub are also being reported. Here toward the south. That's what we have here. We also have the map here, where Anatoly Radov shows Ritkodub and Nove as practically liberated. It stands out that this is again significantly different from what the deep state map shows us, where both villages are firmly in Russian hands. However, we've already talked about this before. In this region, here near Borova, Ukrainian counterattacks have been taking place for weeks, if not months, which are not reflected on the deep state map. That's obviously the downside. I use the deep state map because the technology to use it is compelling. But the operators of deep state are connected to the Ukrainian military, and if they say that nothing should be reported about this, then they stick to it. And that's why in this case, we don't have any relevant reports and have to rely on Russian sources. Fortunately, at least in this regard, when it comes to this area, they admit that the Ukrainians have advanced. Further south of that, we have no changes in the direction of Lyman, and from Sloviansk, we have a video which is quite clear. Here in Sloviansk, we see an obvious Russian fiber optic drone. This can be recognized because the image quality is outstanding, so it's obviously a fiber optic drone that's operating in Sloviansk itself. And here we see normal car traffic taking place. I don't know if that's a car dealership or something else. And here the drone pilot spots a vehicle with what appear to be Ukrainian soldiers on it and proceeds to attack. And we see how the soldiers noticed this at the last moment. One is still on the vehicle and one was next to it. And the drone most likely detonated in the process. Here we can see the vehicle. It's not burning, but in my opinion, it's damaged. And this is obviously a vehicle that arrived here for casualty evacuation. Because it's standing here, it's dark-colored. And we also saw people running away at this spot. And then there was an attack on the evacuation at this location. The downside is, you could see a race here. The downside of fiber optics, of course, is that no radio signal is transmitted. That means the now widely used detectors that can alert, inform the pilots, inform the soldiers. A drone is flying around nearby, which can be detected by the image frequencies and the content. Some of them even have a screen that shows you what the drone itself is currently seeing. That's completely eliminated with a fiber optic drone. And that's how it led to these two successful attacks in Sloviansk. And as we can see, this is already happening within Sloviansk. So even there, the situation is becoming much more difficult. Further south towards Dobropilya, I actually haven't received any new reports from Kostiantynivka. The fighting likely continues there, but I can't confirm any Russian advance. Let's move on to Dobropilya. And there, the Ukrainians say the Russians have gone back on the offensive. They have received reinforcements and are now attacking more frequently. In the latest situation reports, we've repeatedly seen Russian infiltrations in this direction, which show us that the Russians are making more serious attempts to advance again. We even had a mechanized attack, here, in this direction, which also shows that the Russians have tried to advance. And, generally, even when we have a mechanized attack, the Ukrainians say that the Russians are using their usual infiltration tactics. As I said, we were able to visually confirm that Russian infiltrations are still taking place there. We continue farther west, to the south, and there, a Russian mill blogger reports that the Ukrainians are largely in control of Selenia, Lenihe, and Tolstoy. And that's here at these locations. These are the two villages. However, he writes largely in control. That means we can probably assume that Ukrainian strength is growing there, but that there may still be a Russian presence there. So, to already conclude from this that the Ukrainians have both under their control is too early. However, we have repeatedly had Russian military bloggers who say that the Ukrainians are already partially in Mirna and in Podubna. So, Ukrainian counterattacks are also taking place here. This is nothing new either. The Ukrainians have been attacking along this axis for months. Further south along the front, Towards Huliaipol, we have the opposite situation, namely, from the village of Simitsia. Let me find it again for a moment, because it's quite a distance from the front. From Simitsia, here it is, up here, we have a geolocation from Simitsia. There, Ukrainian soldiers took a prisoner of war and showed their flag. The deep state map shows us this further behind the front. That's an infiltration. We can assume that. So the one who was captured was one of the Russian soldiers who was infiltrating there. But it just shows us that the Russians can advance this deep. Judging by what else we're seeing, that would be over 10 kilometers again. We've seen this more and more often lately. That adds to the fact that once the Russians have broken through the first few kilometers, of course they're less likely to be actively searched for, and it's easier for them to advance further. The Russians also sometimes use civilian clothing for this. Of course, that also helps them advance at these points. And so it keeps happening that Russian soldiers are discovered significantly behind the front lines. The whole thing is connected with with reports from Yuliapol that infiltrations are continuing to take place there at this location. But what the Ukrainians are saying is that they are now attacking and reducing Russian logistics 60 to 100 kilometers behind the front. So from the Russian side, it is becoming increasingly difficult to bring supplies to the front. Or rather, it is associated with higher costs and greater losses. Further south along the front, or rather now towards the west. Then we have a Russian mill blogger telling us that the Ukrainians have now liberated Prymorske. That is Prymorske, which is located here and is still listed as contested. According to the Russian mill blogger, there is no longer any Russian presence there. Accordingly, this means that the gray shading should probably be removed. We have an interesting report from Kherson, because here along the river, we have a report from TASS, the Russian state media, stating that Russian troops have managed to repel a Ukrainian attempt to cross the Dnipro. It reportedly happened via the Inhulets, which is this river here. This river here is the Inhulets. That's where it supposedly happened. And Blicka was kind enough to make a geolocation for me, and it was identified here. So it's still significantly on the Ukrainian side, on the river heading toward Dnipro, but not on the Russian side. Now it's unclear how to assess this, of course. Realistically, Ukrainians probably only drive around there if they actually have something planned. So it's quite possible that these soldiers intended to advance to the Russian-held side of the Dnipro. But given the distance, it's too early to say they carried out a landing on the Russian side. And then we also have to say, the whole thing would probably be on a small scale. We can look at the picture here. That's a Ryby, a 6 or 7 meter long Ryby, and there are maybe 4 soldiers on it. So this would have been a Ukrainian infiltration that probably wasn't even comparable to the situation in Krinky, where the Ukrainians were there for months and only rotated individual soldiers, without any major effect. So to expect a serious crossing of the Dnipro here, I think that's simply wrong at this point. At the same time, the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians are having massive problems on the Kinban-Nerung. That pretty much explains itself. We really don't need to interpret that much. The Kinban-Nerung is terrain that's only partially usable, especially when it comes to roads and so on. And at the same time, it's relatively narrow and quite long. Especially with dunes and so on, there are naturally no possibilities for cover. It goes without saying that it is extremely difficult for the Russians to supply their troops there, especially since the distances to the Ukrainian side are easily within FPV drone range, while the Ukrainians can, of course, bring in drones much more easily here than the Russians can defend against them. Therefore, it's clear that if there is any Russian presence on the Kinban-Nerung, it is very, very limited and under a lot of pressure. There have been reports that the Russians may have already withdrawn, so if any presence remains, it's not significant. It's important to note that if Ukrainians use this for a landing, while possible in theory, they'd face the same problem. That's why they still wouldn't be able to advance on the eastern side of the Dnipro for a long time. As for the strategic situation, we of course still have Ukrainian attacks on Russian logistics in the south. It's self-explanatory that these will continue, so we continue to see numerous trucks being hit. This one here was probably a fuel truck that was struck, and the attacks on infrastructure are also continuing. At this point, there is also still intense targeting of Russian air defenses, as well as ships that have been hit again. We also have videos at this point. Somehow this got misplaced. We have videos here where the Ukrainians, and this is interesting, we see these are drones that were launched from the Ukrainian Magura USVs. So, from Ukrainian sea drones, Ukrainian FPV drones were launched here, which are carrying out attacks here. And this is a tell of an S-400 system. And this is a radar system. We see several hits here on Russian air defense equipment. With the tells, it's not always clear if they might be decoys, which is at least theoretically possible. But in any case, they definitely look like the tells of S-300 and S-400 systems. And as I said, what's more remarkable is that the launch clearly took place from the water. Of course, this allows the Ukrainians to use the geography of Crimea, making it possible to deploy relatively inexpensive and precise FPV drones from here, for example, and therefore strike at other locations with less advance warning. This is also a further development. All of this is happening. These attacks are taking place while the Ukrainians have simultaneously strengthened air defenses around Moscow and St. Petersburg. It must be said clearly, this has happened at the expense of Russian air defenses in other locations. If the Russians keep reinforcing Moscow and St. Petersburg, they'll likely have to move resources from elsewhere. We have talked several times on this channel about how it's unrealistic for the Russians to keep up with the current losses. And while the Ukrainians are expanding their targets at the same time, the Russians now have to better protect the high-value targets, which of course means they have to give up protection elsewhere, reduce it, or abandon it entirely. All this happened while there was an attack on a Starlink jammer in Krasnodar Krai. And while you can interpret that in different ways, I looked at the data, the geolocation, which is here, and that shows us it's right along the coast. These are jammers that are capable of interfering with Starlink satellites themselves, thus degrading or stopping communication. And because it's right on the shore of the Black Sea, it's too early to conclude from this that the Russians are already preparing for the Ukrainians to be able to use Starlink inside Russia soon. Realistically, Starlink should work over the Black Sea. So it should work right up to the immediate vicinity of the shore here. And then, of course, it also makes sense to have a jamming device here, even if it's not on occupied Ukrainian territory. The intense shelling of Odessa, meanwhile, continues. The intention is, of course, clear: to stop Ukrainian sea exports through the city. And there was also a Russian attack on the bridge near Majaki, right here at this location. And as we can see, that's to the south, or rather, west, so on the way south from Odessa. In this case, west of Odessa. And recently, there were also attacks carried out on the bridge near Satoka, right here at this location. This bridge was attacked relatively early in the war, but it was never destroyed. The latest reports are that it has now actually been taken out. I haven't seen visual confirmation yet. Here, it's clear the goal is to cut off the Odessa region from Romania, blocking the southern route. The likely and obvious intention is to make exports through southern or Romanian ports more difficult, because Russia is mainly attacking the port facilities in Odessa, aiming to stop Ukrainian sea exports, which are important for the Ukrainian economy. And if that fails, then in theory, you could bring the grain, for example, here to the Danube ports and export it from there. Or maybe you could transport it by truck or by train to Romania and export it through Romanian ports. But for that, the vehicles need to be able to travel south. And that's why the Russian attacks are happening, to stop this. Meanwhile, the Russians are also attacking Ukrainian logistics elsewhere. Further attacks are being carried out on trains. In this case, a passenger train near Sumy was attacked, and Ukrainian railway facilities are also being attacked in other places. This has been documented. Let's move on to the report about the drone in Leipzig. The drone actually hit the wing of the Antonov hours before it was discovered. However, it did not detonate. The explosive became detached in the process, so the drone was harmless afterward, and a DNA trace that was found is said to match the one from the DHL Logistics Center where an arson attack was carried out. Since there have been arrests in this regard, it would suggest that the person who provided the explosives is still at large in connection with these attacks. We talked about it here on the channel that it is logical that Semtex was provided by state actors, that it's pretty unlikely that it was made at home, which is at least theoretically possible with other explosives. And obviously, the person who provided the explosives is likely still at large at this point, and was also involved in this attack. From the article, on impact, the explosive reportedly detached from the drone and landed some distance from the aircraft. In addition, the bus driver is said not to have knocked the drone out of the air with a kick, but rather discovered the object on the ground, held it in place with his foot, and then informed the security personnel. There was initially a report that he had kicked it to pieces or knocked it out of the air with a kick. So that has now turned out to be false. And luckily for him, the explosives were no longer attached to the drone. That too has now been corrected. The Ukrainians believe that 30 to 30,000 North Korean soldiers will be transferred to Russia. That would be the strength of about 8 brigades. If they come with their own equipment and then directly participate in the fighting, it will be a clear challenge for Ukraine. We've discussed this before. The Russians are likely losing 30,000 men monthly. That means 30,000 to 50,000 North Koreans would effectively only make up for 1 or 2 months of Russian losses, which would of course relieve the Russians, but at the same time shouldn't bring about a decisive change. It would be different if they brought their own equipment and attempted mechanized attacks, for example. And then there are different challenges. If they attack in a concentrated way, or attack with other tactics, that could be a new challenge for Ukraine, especially if it is combined with a possible Russian mobilization, which is widely expected, because that would mean an increase in Russian forces. There is a calculation here about what this would mean, which I find relatively reasonable and understandable. According to this, with mobilization, it could be up to 267,000 additional combat troops. Considering that, of course, not every soldier is at the front, but many are also in support roles. In total, the strength of the combat troops would then increase to up to 845,000 men from the current approximately 400,000. So there could be a drastic increase in the forces in Russia and Ukraine that would take place here. Although I paused for a moment and noticed that the calculation doesn't really add up to 845,000, if a ratio of 4 to 7 is used, it doesn't work out. But it would still be 600,000 to 700,000 men. That is also more than enough, and could at least lead to a 1.5-fold increase in combat troops at the front, which would of course be a major threat to the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, the Russians are also producing more missiles. Overall, they are producing 110 to 120% of the planned amount per month. The annual plan for Zircon and Unix has already been fulfilled after just 7 months. That means the Russians have already produced as many Zircon and Unix cruise missiles as they plan to produce for the entire year. Russia, according to the Ukrainians, is shifting its resources to systems that are more promising. That's why more cruise missiles and ballistic missiles are being built now. That makes sense, because right now, they of course have a higher success rate due to the weakened Ukrainian air defense. Additionally, the Ukrainians report that more Garan 4 and Garan 5 are being built. These are Shahed drones used by the Russians. The Russians call their version the Garan, and those 4 and 5 models are equipped with jet engines. Recently, there was also an attack where 50% of the drones had jet engines. In addition, the Kinjal missile production has been stopped. That's quite interesting. Kinjal is generally referred to as an Iskander-M that is launched from aircraft, specifically from the MiG-31. The Russians promoted it as hypersonic, but Western experts say that, effectively, it's just an air-launched ballistic missile that doesn't meet the requirements of a hypersonic missile. That could confirm it now, because there have been repeated reports that the Kinjal is being shot down in the same way as the Iskander. And that would suggest that the Russians probably believe that switching to the Iskander-M might make more sense. Maybe the production of the Kinjal is more complicated, or some components are more expensive or harder to get. In any case, production has now been stopped. But realistically, that probably won't make much of a difference, because the missiles are comparable to the Iskander-M, and a few more of those are being produced now than before. From the political sphere, we have Maxim Kalashnikov. He complains about the situation. The fact that Serbia has now sided with Kyiv and the West should not be surprising. What would you expect in the 5th year of the war, when the economy of the Russian Federation is collapsing and the enemy is striking deep into our rear areas. Like many others, President Vučić also considers the Russian Federation to be the losing side. Just like Turkey, the U.S. State Department has informed Congress about the planned transfer of American weapons systems located in Turkey to Ukraine. This includes launchers for MLRS rockets, rocket launchers, and ATACMS missiles. By the way, if we are to believe the official statements, Turkey is our valued geopolitical partner, for whom we are building the nuclear power plant in Akuyu at our own expense. So what if they're handing over HIMARS and missiles to Kyiv in the process? Question mark. It's a minor detail, really. But seriously, the missed opportunity for a quick victory in 2014, the inability to conduct a successful blitzkrieg in 2022, and getting bogged down in a stalemated trench war. All of this has led to the Russian Federation being seen as a lame duck. Now even Serbia is drifting away, and Lukashenko is behaving more and more cunningly. In fact, Ukraine will most likely remain Ukraine. 70 ATACMS, those are older versions, but with a range of 300 kilometers and equipped with cluster munitions. And those should be really helpful, because with 300 kilometers they realistically reach about 200 kilometers into Russia. The Ukrainians, of course, won't use them directly from the border itself, but you can expect them to reach about 200 to 250 kilometers across the border, and that will repeatedly give the opportunity to attack Russian TELs, the Iskander launchers, because these are by no means hundreds of kilometers away either. The Iskander itself has a limited range, and if the Russians want to fire deep into Ukraine, then of course they can't be too far from the Ukrainian border, and that's where these 70 can actually help, because they're fast enough. The problem is, of course, you can also intercept Russian TELs when they're deep inside Russia, if you have drones that are on site and can communicate. That's why former Defense Minister Fedorov is currently trying to convince Elon Musk to allow Starlink to be used inside Russia for Ukraine, so they can carry out exactly these attacks and prevent the Russians from launching missiles at Ukraine. But this drone has to be close enough. Even if they can communicate, it still has to be within striking distance before the launch vehicle has gotten to safety. And the attack has to happen within minutes. If it turns out that you have the ATACMS within striking range and the targeting data and target designation happen quickly enough, then these missiles are ideal. Because since they have cluster munitions, they don't have to hit exactly. They cover a relatively larger area. That means even if the vehicle has just started moving, there's still a decent chance to destroy it. They should be helpful in that regard. If the Russians have any aircraft within range at airports, those would also be targets. That was the issue. The Ukrainians wanted to use something like that against the airports in Russia, where the bombers were stationed that kept attacking Ukraine with glide bombs. And back then, Joe Biden still forbade that. Now things are quite different. Also being delivered are 12 M270 multiple rocket launchers. These are the ones we see here. The Bundeswehr also has some of these and has handed some over to the Ukrainians. It's comparable to the HIMARS system, except it's tracked and can carry twice as many rockets. But it can carry the identical rockets. All these rockets can also be fired from the HIMARS system. And Ukraine is receiving 2,524 M26 DPICM rockets. And DPICM are basically cluster munitions again. But unless a special version was delivered, which I don't see mentioned here, these only have a range of 32 kilometers. For that, they deliver the impressive number of 644 bomblets. That means they cause relatively large damage with the cluster munitions. However, as I said, only 32 kilometers range. That means the launch vehicle has to move relatively close to the front. Also delivered are 47,203 203mm shells, also with cluster munitions. They will most likely be fired from the formerly Greek, M110s that Ukraine has received. Again, with a limited range. That means, while it's generally good for Ukraine to receive this ammunition, it must be clearly stated that it will be difficult to use it in the current frontline situation, because the artillery that has to get within 20 to 30 kilometers of its target is, of course, highly vulnerable at the moment. However, if the Russians at any point manage to return to mobile warfare, then these systems will, of course, be of enormous importance. Because if the Russian vehicles are moving, they won't have the same level of drone support as they do during the current positional warfare. And then these systems can of course destroy the Russian spearheads by using cluster munitions. And finally, we have a video where the German Skynex system demonstrates its capabilities during an operation in Ukraine. And there you can see, on the one hand, how Shahed drones are being shot down, and then you see the system being used against Kalibr missiles. I believe that's what it is. We'll see in a moment. Against cruise missiles, which are being shot down with it. We can see the hits here, and that the cruise missile starts to tumble and crashes. That means, here too, the system is showing its effectiveness and its usefulness in Ukraine at this point. That's today's report. Please give a thumbs up to help the algorithm, and comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. The next live stream with a situation report is next Wednesday at 8 p.m. German time. You can ask questions during the Q&A session. If you have questions now, I'll address them then. 8 p.m. German time. I'd love to see you there. That's all from me for now. Thanks for your attention and see you soon. A special thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori, as well as to Lieutenants Finn, 5up, Flecktan, Jans vom Eck, Uwe Dufresne, nickname Tubib, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42 Vision, Soundlab, Immelkopf, Floja, Capri, Beertainment, Licht, Chatter, NTX, Malermeisternagel, Markus F., Alex Rosenthal, Madbest, Mütter 1000 Janiscu, Cunningham 4500 and you, Stress. Thank you very much. Without you, it wouldn't be possible yet.